On the night of November 7th, 1943, three men experienced the same event in radically different ways. Bumpy Johnson believed he was making an example of betrayal that would echo throughout Harlem. Marcus "Slim" Peterson, on his knees in an abandoned warehouse on 145th Street, was certain he would die within the next few hours. Bumpy's four men waited for orders to execute yet another demonstration of calculated power, but what none of them knew, not Slim, not the enforcers, not even the observers hidden in the shadows, was that Bumpy had made a decision 72 hours earlier that would transform that night of planned execution into a masterclass in psychological warfare. Slim Peterson had betrayed Bumpy Johnson. He sold information about numbers racket collection routes to Frank Costello's organization for $400. 4 of Bumpy's men were arrested. $23,000 were confiscated. By the logic of Harlem's underworld, Slim should have been dead within 24 hours, but Bumpy Johnson never operated by conventional logic. This is the analysis of the night Bumpy broke every rule of the criminal code, and in doing so, created a psychological weapon more powerful than any bullet ever fired in Harlem. To understand why Bumpy Johnson made the most counterintuitive decision of his career that November night, we must first understand the delicate ecosystem of power in 1943 Harlem. The Second World War was draining young men from the streets, creating both opportunity and chaos in the underground economy. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery system where people bet pennies on three-digit numbers, was generating approximately $2 million annually in Harlem alone. This wasn't just gambling. For thousands of black families locked out of legitimate banking systems, the numbers racket was savings account, investment portfolio, and economic lifeline combined into one. Bumpy Johnson, at 38 years old, controlled roughly 40% of Harlem's numbers operations. He wasn't the biggest. That distinction belonged to the Italian mobs moving in from downtown. He wasn't the oldest, Caspar Holstein and Madame Stephanie Saint. Claire had been running numbers when Bumpy was still in short pants, but Bumpy possessed something that made him more dangerous than size or seniority. He understood that true power wasn't held by the man who could hurt the most people, but by the man who controlled information and wielded fear as a surgical instrument rather than a blunt object. The Harlem Bumpy operated in was a pressure cooker of competing interests. The 5 families of the Italian mafia, Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, Colombo, saw Harlem's black population as an untapped revenue stream. They wanted the numbers, the heroin distribution networks that were just beginning to form, the after-hours clubs, the protection rackets. But they faced a problem. Harlem's community wouldn't accept white mobsters the way Little Italy or the Irish neighborhoods did. They needed black operators, men like Bumpy, men who could be partners or puppets, depending on how smart they were. Bumpy had carved out his position through a combination of strategic violence and community protection that seemed contradictory, but formed a coherent philosophy. He would brutally eliminate anyone who preyed on Harlem's weakest, the women, the children, the elderly, but he would negotiate, compromise, even ally with those who showed respect for the community's boundaries. His relationship with Lucky Luciano was complex. Not friendship, not pure enmity, but a mutual recognition that they could make more money in wary cooperation than in all-out war. This was the world on November 4th, 1943, when Bumpy Johnson received the phone call that would test every principle he'd built his reputation on. The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. Bumpy was at the Red Rooster, a restaurant on 138th Street and 7th Avenue, eating fried chicken and reading Machiavelli's The Prince for the 4th time. He'd been annotating the margins, comparing Renaissance Italian power dynamics to Harlem's current situation. When his bodyguard, a man called Junie Bird, handed him the phone with an expression that said everything, Bumpy carefully marked his page before taking the receiver. The voice belonged to Detective William Johnson, no relation, but a man who'd been on Bumpy's payroll for 6 years. "We got 4 of your boys at the 28th Precinct," the detective said without preamble. "Caught them on Lenox Avenue with the day's receipts, 23,000 in small bills. The tip came from inside Bumpy. Someone gave us the exact route, exact time, exact corner." Bumpy's face showed nothing. Around him, the Red Rooster continued its normal rhythm. Duke Ellington played on the jukebox. Men argued about Joe Lewis's upcoming fight. A couple in the corner booth laughed at some private joke. "Who made the arrest?" Bumpy asked. "Captain Morrison. He's not ours. He's been trying to build a case against you for 2 years. This gave him exactly what he needed." The 4 men. Bails set at 5,000 each. But Morrison's talking RICO charges, talking about making examples. "Bumpy, he knows this hurts you more than just the money. He knows this makes you look weak." Bumpy thanked the detective and hung up. He sat very still for nearly 3 minutes, his chicken growing cold, his mind working through the mathematics of betrayal. Only 7 people knew the exact collection route for that day. 3 were now in custody. 3 others were soldiers who'd been with him for over a decade, men who'd taken bullets for him, men whose families Bumpy supported. That left 1 person, Marcus "Slim" Peterson. Slim was a recent addition to Bumpy's organization, recruited 8 months earlier on the recommendation of Madame St. Clair herself. 26 years old, smart, ambitious, with a gift for numbers that made him valuable in the policy banks where bets were recorded and payouts calculated. Bumpy had liked the young man's hustle, his eagerness to prove himself. He'd given Slim access to operational details as a test of loyalty and competence. Apparently, Slim had failed the test. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Bumpy had confirmation. 2 separate sources, a bartender at the Savoy Ballroom and a numbers runner who'd seen Slim talking to a known Costello associate, placed Slim in conversation with the enemy 3 days before the arrest. A third source, a woman who worked as a maid in Slim's boarding house, reported that Slim had suddenly paid 2 months of back rent in cash the day after those conversations. $400. That's what Bumpy's people calculated Slim had been paid. $400 for information that cost Bumpy $23,000 in seized money, tens of thousands more in legal fees and bail, and something infinitely more valuable, reputation. In the Harlem underworld, word was already spreading. Bumpy Johnson's operation had been penetrated. Bumpy Johnson's men were in jail. Bumpy Johnson was vulnerable. The question that consumed Harlem's criminal class over the next 72 hours was simple. How would Bumpy respond? The conventional wisdom was universal. Slim Peterson was a dead man. The only questions were when, where, and how public the execution would be. Some predicted Slim would simply disappear, his body never found, a ghost story to discourage future traitors. Others anticipated a public killing, something dramatic on a street corner during busy hours, a message written in blood that everyone could read. The betting at Small's Paradise favored a middle approach. Slim would be found in an alley, beaten to death, his mouth stuffed with $401 bills. But Bumpy Johnson didn't do what anyone expected. On November 5th, Bumpy sent word through the streets that he wanted Slim found but not touched. The message spread through pool halls, barbershops, policy banks, and after-hours clubs. Bumpy wants Slim alive. Bring him in, don't hurt him. There's $500 for whoever delivers him unharmed. This caused confusion. Why would Bumpy pay more to capture the traitor than the traitor had been paid to betray him? What game was being played? Slim, for his part, had gone to ground the moment the arrests went down. He knew the mathematics as well as anyone. He'd taken Costello's money, gambled that the Italian mob's protection would shield him from Bumpy's wrath, and now realized he'd miscalculated catastrophically. Costello wasn't going to war with Bumpy Johnson over a low-level informant. Slim was expendable. He'd sold his life for $400 and a fantasy of mob protection that evaporated the moment it was tested. For 2 days, Slim hid in a series of locations across Harlem, moving every few hours, trusting no one. He considered running. Philly, Detroit, maybe Chicago. But he had no money beyond the quickly dwindling 400. He had no connections outside New York, and he knew that running would only delay the inevitable. Bumpy's reach extended far beyond Harlem. Men who crossed Bumpy Johnson had been found in other cities, other states. Geography was no protection. On the evening of November 6th, Slim made a decision born of desperation and exhausted logic. He would turn himself into Bumpy directly, not through intermediaries, not through third parties, but face to face. It was a gamble, but Slim's options had narrowed to a single choice: die running or die trying to negotiate. At least negotiation offered a sliver of possibility. At 10:43 that night, Slim Peterson walked into the Renaissance Ballroom on 138th Street, where he knew Bumpy would be watching the amateur boxing matches. Every eye turned to watch him enter. The crowd parted like water around a stone. Slim walked across the floor, his hands visible and empty, his body language screaming surrender. He stopped 10 feet from where Bumpy sat in a private box, surrounded by 4 bodyguards. "I'm here," Slim said. His voice didn't shake. That impressed several people who witnessed the moment. "I did what you know I did. I'm here to face whatever comes." Bumpy studied him for a long moment. The boxing match continued in the ring behind them, but no one was watching the fighters anymore. "You got courage, I'll give you that," Bumpy finally said. "Junie, take Mr. Peterson to the warehouse on 145. Make him comfortable. I'll be along." 3 hours later, at 1:57 in the morning of November 7th, Bumpy Johnson walked into the warehouse where Marcus Peterson waited. The space was typical of dozens scattered across Harlem. Abandoned commercial building, windows painted black, single entrance that could be watched and controlled. Slim sat in a wooden chair in the center of the concrete floor, his hands untied, 4 of Bumpy's men standing in the shadows. A single work light hung from the ceiling, creating a pool of harsh illumination that left the corners in darkness. Bumpy dismissed 3 of the 4 guards with a gesture, leaving only Junie Bird. He pulled up a second chair and sat facing Slim, close enough to reach out and touch him. For nearly a minute, neither man spoke. Slim could smell the whiskey on Bumpy's breath, the cigarette smoke in his clothes, the pomade in his hair. Bumpy could see the fear Slim was working so hard to control, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his jaw muscles clenched and released, the sweat starting to darken his collar despite the November cold. "Tell me why," Bumpy said finally. It wasn't the question Slim expected, not "Where's the money?" or "Who else knows?" or "Are you ready to die?" Just "Tell me why." The simplicity of it was more terrifying than threats would have been. Slim took a breath. "I got a daughter," he said, 3 years old. Her mother died in childbirth last year. I've been raising her alone. The money I was making running numbers, it wasn't enough. She got sick in September. Pneumonia. The hospital bills, the medicine, the special food the doctor said she needed. I went into debt, bad debt, to people who don't wait for payment. "How much debt?" Bumpy asked. $375. Bumpy's expression didn't change. "And Costello's people offered you 400. "Yes, sir." "Did you tell them what they paid for? Did you know my men would be arrested?" "They said they just wanted to know the routes. Said they were planning their own operation, wanted to avoid conflicts. I knew it was bullshit. I knew what would happen. I did it anyway." This was the moment that defined what happened next. Slim didn't lie, didn't make excuses, didn't try to minimize his choice. He stated the facts with the flat affect of a man who'd already accepted his death and was just waiting for the formality to complete itself. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "You got family besides the daughter?" No, sir. Parents dead? No siblings? Just her. Where is she now? With a neighbor lady on 123rd Street, Mrs. Hawkins. She's good people. Been watching her while I worked. Bumpy stood and walked a slow circle around Slim's chair. His footsteps echoed in the empty warehouse. When he completed the circuit, he stopped directly behind Slim, close enough that Slim could feel his body heat. This was the position executioners took. Slim closed his eyes. "You know what the rules say I gotta do," Bumpy said quietly. "You betrayed the organization. You got my men arrested. You cost me money and reputation. The rules are clear. I make an example, send a message, maintain order through fear. That's how this world works." "Yes, sir," Slim whispered. "But I'm going to tell you something nobody in this room will ever repeat." Bumpy walked back around to face Slim. "The rules are a trap. They make us predictable. They make us slaves to expectation. Every man in Harlem knows what I'm supposed to do to you. Frank Costello knows. Lucky Luciano knows. The NYPD knows. They're all waiting to see Bumpy Johnson do exactly what Bumpy Johnson always does, which means they think they understand me. They think they can predict me. They think they've got me figured out." Bumpy sat down again. "But what if I don't do what I'm supposed to do? What if I break the rules everyone thinks I'm bound by? What happens then?" Slim opened his eyes, confusion replacing terror. "I don't understand." "You will." Bumpy turned to Junie. "How much money you got on you?" Junie pulled out a roll of bills. "About 200. Give it to Mr. Peterson." Junie's hand froze halfway to Slim. "Boss, you heard me." The money changed hands. Slim stared at it like a foreign object. "That covers your debt," Bumpy said. "Tomorrow you're gonna go to Mrs. Hawkins, get your daughter, and you're gonna disappear. Not to Philly or Chicago. Somewhere nobody knows you. Somewhere you can start clean." "I got a cousin runs a numbers operation in New Orleans. Good man, no Harlem connections. I'll make a call, get you work. Legitimate work, clean money. You'll be a runner at first, same as you started here. But if you're smart like I think you are, you can build something." Slim's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "In exchange, you're gonna do 3 things," Bumpy continued. "First, you're gonna remember this moment every single day for the rest of your life. You're gonna remember that I could have killed you and I didn't. Second, you're gonna raise that daughter right. Keep her away from this life. Make sure she gets educated, gets opportunities, becomes someone who contributes something besides fear to this world. Third, and this is the important one, you're gonna tell this story. Everywhere you go, everyone you meet in the life, you tell them exactly what happened." Bumpy Johnson caught the man who betrayed him, and instead of killing him, he gave him money and a second chance. "You understand me?" "No," Slim said honestly. "I don't understand any of this." "You will," Bumpy repeated. "Maybe not today, maybe not for years, but eventually you'll understand that I didn't save you because I'm soft or because I'm merciful. I saved you because you're worth more to me alive than dead. Dead, you're just another body, another message that gets forgotten in a week. Alive, you're a walking mystery. Alive, you make people question everything they think they know about me. Alive, you create uncertainty in my enemies' minds, and uncertainty is the most powerful weapon there is." Bumpy stood and walked toward the warehouse door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "Junie, take Mr. Peterson home. Make sure he gets to his daughter safe. Tomorrow you'll escort both of them to Penn Station, put them on a train to New Orleans. I'll have the contact information ready by morning." Then he was gone, leaving Slim Peterson sitting in a pool of light, holding $200 he didn't earn, processing a mercy he didn't deserve, trying to understand a calculation that wouldn't make sense for another decade. What Slim couldn't know, what none of the witnesses could understand, was that Bumpy Johnson had been planning this exact scenario for 72 hours. The moment he confirmed Slim's betrayal, Bumpy's mind started working through possibilities. The conventional response was obvious: kill Slim, display the body, restore fear and respect. It was what everyone expected. It was what the code demanded. It was what made sense. But Bumpy Johnson built his empire by doing what made sense on a different level than his opponents operated on. He understood something fundamental about human psychology that most criminals missed. Predictability is weakness. When your enemies know exactly what you'll do, they can plan around you. They can manipulate you. They can use your own consistency against you. But when you become unpredictable, when you violate expectations in ways that seem irrational but serve deeper purposes, you create a different kind of power. You create psychological uncertainty. In the 3 days between discovering Slim's betrayal and confronting him in the warehouse, Bumpy had analyzed the situation from every angle. He'd considered who would be watching his response, what messages they would derive from different actions, how those interpretations would affect future calculations. Frank Costello would be watching, trying to gauge whether Bumpy was still strong enough to protect his territory. Lucky Luciano would be watching, assessing whether their uneasy cooperation was still viable. The NYPD would be watching, looking for signs of weakness they could exploit. Every numbers runner, policy banker, and street enforcer in Harlem would be watching, deciding whether Bumpy Johnson was still the man they feared and respected. A conventional execution would send a conventional message: betray Bumpy and die. Strong, clear, expected. But expected messages fade quickly. They confirm what everyone already believes. They don't create stories. They don't generate uncertainty. Letting Slim live while appearing to have the perfect justification to kill him, that sent a much more complex message. It said, Bumpy Johnson can't be predicted. Bumpy Johnson operates by rules you don't understand. Bumpy Johnson might be merciful, or he might be playing a game so subtle you can't see the pieces moving. And that uncertainty, that inability to predict, that mystery, it made Bumpy more dangerous, not less. But the calculation went deeper than simple psychological warfare. Bumpy understood that Slim Peterson, alive and talking, was worth more than Slim Peterson dead and silent. Every time Slim told the story, and he would tell it, Bumpy was certain, because it was the most remarkable thing that would ever happen to him. It would spread Bumpy's legend in ways that couldn't be bought or forced. It would create a mythology. The man who showed mercy when he could have shown violence, the strategist who valued influence over intimidation, the leader who thought in decades while others thought in days. And there was something else, something Bumpy barely admitted even to himself. He was tired of killing, not morally opposed to it. He understood violence as a necessary tool in the world he'd chosen, but tired of the predictability of it, the waste of it, the way it solved short-term problems while creating long-term complications. Every body created grieving families, potential revenge, police attention, moral debt. What if there was a way to achieve the same ends without the same costs? What if mercy, strategically deployed, could be as effective as murder? This was the experiment Bumpy Johnson conducted on November 7th, 1943. An experiment in asymmetric power, in psychological warfare, in long-term influence over short-term intimidation. And Marcus Slim Peterson was the test case, the proof of concept, the walking demonstration of a principle that would reshape how Bumpy operated for the rest of his career. The immediate aftermath of Slim's release created exactly the confusion Bumpy anticipated. Within hours, word spread through Harlem's underground. Bumpy caught the traitor and let him go. The response was universal bewilderment. Men who'd worked with Bumpy for years couldn't make sense of it. Some thought Bumpy was going soft. Others suspected a longer game they couldn't see yet. A few wondered if Slim had some leverage they didn't know about. The speculation was endless and contradictory, which was precisely the point. Frank Costello heard the news and called a meeting with his top lieutenants. They spent 3 hours trying to understand Bumpy's play. Was it weakness? A signal that Bumpy wanted peace? A setup for something larger? They couldn't agree, couldn't find a framework that made the decision comprehensible. In the end, Costello made the only logical choice when facing an incomprehensible opponent. He became more cautious. The planned expansion into Bumpy's Harlem territory was postponed indefinitely. Too much uncertainty, too much risk of misreading the situation. Lucky Luciano, who knew Bumpy better than most, had a different interpretation. "Bumpy's evolving," he told his confidants. "Most men in this business, they learn one way to operate, and they stick with it until someone kills them. Bumpy keeps changing, keeps adapting. That's why he's dangerous. You can't prepare for him because he won't be the same man next year that he is today." The NYPD's response was frustrated confusion. Captain Morrison, who'd been building his case against Bumpy, found his investigation stalling. The anticipated gang war over Slim's betrayal never materialized. The expected retaliation killing never occurred. Morrison's theory that Bumpy Johnson was a predictable criminal who could be understood and therefore caught through pattern analysis collapsed. If Bumpy didn't follow the criminal code consistently, how could you build a case on predicted behavior? But the most important audience for Bumpy's decision was Harlem itself. The community that Bumpy both protected and preyed upon, that feared and respected him in equal measure, that understood him as a necessary evil in a world that offered few choices to black people trying to survive in a white supremacist system. For them, the story of Slim Peterson became something more than a crime story. It became a parable. In barbershops and beauty parlors, on stoops and in kitchens, people discussed what Bumpy had done. Some saw it as weakness. Man betrayed him, he should have died, they argued. Others saw strategic brilliance. Bumpy's showing he's smarter than the trigger-happy fools who think violence solves everything. Still, others saw something almost redemptive. Maybe Bumpy's got a soul after all. Maybe he understands that we're all just trying to survive. The variety of interpretations was itself powerful. Different people could project different meanings onto the same action, which meant Bumpy became a more complex figure in the community's imagination. Not just a criminal enforcer, but a man capable of surprising choices, contradictory impulses, strategic depth that transcended simple categorization. One of the most affected observers was a young man named Malcolm Little, who in 1943 was still years away from becoming Malcolm X. Malcolm was running numbers for a different operator, watching Bumpy's career with the attention of an ambitious student studying a master. Years later, after his transformation into one of America's most important voices for black liberation, Malcolm would cite Bumpy's strategic thinking as foundational to his own understanding of power. "Bumpy taught me that the most powerful move isn't always the obvious one," Malcolm told an interviewer in 1963. "White power in America is predictable. It responds to black resistance with violence, to black success with sabotage, to black humanity with dehumanization. But Bumpy showed me that unpredictability, the ability to do what your enemy doesn't expect, creates space for maneuver that consistency never can. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also a teacher of strategic thought." For Bumpy himself, the decision to spare Slim represented a turning point in his operational philosophy. He'd tested a hypothesis that strategic mercy could be as effective as strategic violence, and the results exceeded his expectations. The psychological impact, the multiplication of his legend through storytelling, the uncertainty created in his opponents' minds, all of it confirmed that there were dimensions of power he'd only begun to explore. In the months that followed, Bumpy refined this approach. He didn't abandon violence, that would have been naive in his world. But he became more selective about when and how he deployed it, more thoughtful about the messages different actions would send, more strategic about cultivating a reputation for unpredictability that made opponents hesitant and allies loyal. He also began a practice that would continue for the rest of his life, identifying young men in the organization who showed potential but made mistakes, and giving them second chances when conventional wisdom demanded punishment. Not everyone, not indiscriminately, but carefully selected individuals who Bumpy believed could learn and grow. Some of them betrayed the second chance and faced the consequences, but others became some of Bumpy's most loyal and effective operators, men who knew they owed their lives to Bumpy's mercy and never forgot it. One of those men was a young enforcer named Frank Lucas, who years later would build his own criminal empire. Lucas had been caught skimming money from the numbers operations in 1946. The standard punishment was death, or at minimum, severe beating and expulsion from the organization. Bumpy chose a third option. He made Lucas his driver and bodyguard, a position of trust that communicated both forgiveness and expectation. Lucas would later say that moment defined his life. Bumpy showed me that power isn't just about hurting people. It's about knowing when to hurt them and when to heal them. That lesson made me a millionaire. As for Marcus "Slim" Peterson, he kept his promises to Bumpy with a devotion that bordered on religious. He took his daughter to New Orleans on November 8, 1943. He started as a numbers runner for Bumpy's cousin and worked his way up through competence and obsessive honesty. By 1950, he was managing the entire New Orleans operation. By 1955, he'd saved enough to buy a small legitimate business, a dry cleaning chain that eventually expanded to 7 locations. His daughter, raised on the story of the night Bumpy Johnson spared her father's life, became a teacher, then a principal, then a district superintendent of schools in New Orleans. She put 3 generations of black children through education programs that emphasized critical thinking, strategic planning, and the power of unexpected choices. She never knew the criminal details of her father's history, but she absorbed the core lesson that the most powerful actions are often the ones that violate expectations. Slim died in 1974 at the age of 57, 6 years after Bumpy's death. His last words, according to his daughter who was with him, were, "Tell the story. Tell people about the night I should have died and didn't. Tell them Bumpy Johnson understood something about power that most men never learn." And Slim did tell the story, exactly as Bumpy had instructed, to every person he met in the criminal world, to young men tempted by easy money and violent solutions, to anyone who would listen. The story spread and mutated and evolved, but its core remained constant. Bumpy Johnson had the perfect right to kill and chose not to. Bumpy Johnson valued strategic mercy over predictable violence. Bumpy Johnson couldn't be understood by conventional rules. That story became one of dozens, then hundreds, that formed the mythology of Bumpy Johnson, tales of strategic brilliance, of unpredictable choices, of a man who operated on a level that transcended simple criminality. Some of the stories were true, some were exaggerated, some were probably fabricated, but all of them served the same purpose. They made Bumpy Johnson larger than life, more complex than categorization, more powerful than his actual resources might suggest. This was the secret that Bumpy understood before most of his contemporaries. In the world of organized crime, reputation is currency. Physical power, guns, enforcers, money is important but finite. Reputational power, fear, respect, mystery, legend is theoretically infinite. It can be multiplied through stories, enhanced through strategic actions that generate compelling narratives, weaponized through careful cultivation of an image that serves your interests. By letting Slim Peterson live, Bumpy Johnson invested $200 and a potential weakness in exchange for a story that would pay dividends for the rest of his career. Every time someone told the story, Bumpy's power grew slightly. Every time a potential enemy heard it and reconsidered their plans, Bumpy gained an advantage. Every time a young man in Harlem heard it and thought, maybe there's a smarter way than killing, Bumpy's philosophy propagated itself beyond his direct control. The decision also had an impact on Bumpy's relationship with law enforcement that he hadn't fully anticipated. Captain Morrison, frustrated by his inability to predict Bumpy's actions, eventually transferred out of Harlem. His replacement, a detective named Thomas Murphy, took a different approach. Instead of trying to build a RICO case based on pattern analysis, Murphy recognized that Bumpy was too sophisticated for conventional prosecution. He focused instead on maintaining an uneasy détente, limiting Bumpy's violence while accepting that the numbers racket and other illegal enterprises would continue. This arrangement suited Bumpy perfectly. He didn't want all-out war with the police. He wanted to operate with enough freedom to maintain his empire while keeping violence low enough that the political pressure for crackdowns remained manageable. Murphy's pragmatic approach created space for exactly that balance, and Bumpy made sure Murphy was compensated well enough to maintain his cooperation, while also ensuring that Murphy knew Bumpy's reputation for unpredictability meant that cooperation was the safest course. The financial math of Bumpy's decision is worth examining. The immediate cost, $200 cash. The perceived risk of appearing weak. The violation of criminal code expectations. The immediate benefit, Slim alive and telling stories that enhanced Bumpy's reputation. But the long-term calculation was far more favorable. Over the next 25 years, until Bumpy's death in 1968, the story of Slim Peterson was cited in at least 14 documented instances where potential conflicts were avoided because opponents second-guessed their understanding of Bumpy's likely response. One particularly notable case occurred in 1957. A young, ambitious operator named Vincent Chin Gigante, who would later become one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York, was planning a takeover of some of Bumpy's territory in East Harlem. Gigante's crew had done the math. They had more guns, more money, more political connections. On paper, they should have been able to overwhelm Bumpy's operation. But during the planning meetings, one of Gigante's advisors brought up the Slim Peterson story. "Bumpy let a traitor live," the advisor said. "Why? What does he know that we don't? What move is he planning that we can't see? This guy's been in the game 30 years and he's still on top. Maybe we're missing something." That uncertainty, that nagging feeling that they didn't fully understand Bumpy's strategic thinking, made Gigante hesitate. The hesitation turned into a negotiation. The negotiation resulted in a territorial division that gave Bumpy less than he'd held before, but avoided a war that might have destroyed both organizations. Bumpy accepted the compromise not because he was weak, but because he'd achieved his larger goal, maintaining operational continuity without devastating violence. When told about Gigante's hesitation and its source, Bumpy laughed. "Slim Peterson's the best investment I ever made," he said. $200 24 years ago, and it's still paying dividends. That's better than anything on Wall Street. The strategic principle Bumpy demonstrated became a template that influenced how he trained the next generation of Harlem operators. Frank Lucas learned it. Nicky Barnes learned it. Even legitimate political figures like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who knew Bumpy and occasionally cooperated with him on community protection issues, absorbed aspects of the philosophy. The lesson was consistent. Predictable power is limited power. Unpredictable power, wielded strategically, creates exponential advantages. But there's a deeper dimension to the Slim Peterson decision that's worth examining: the moral complexity of mercy in an immoral system. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. He ran illegal lotteries, engaged in violence, corrupted law enforcement, and profited from poor people's desperate hopes for financial escape. Nothing about letting Slim live changes those fundamental facts. This wasn't a redemption story. This wasn't evidence that Bumpy was secretly a good man, forced into bad circumstances. What it was instead was evidence that human beings, even those operating in brutal systems, are capable of complex moral reasoning that transcends simple categorization. Bumpy's mercy toward Slim wasn't altruistic. It was strategic. But strategy and morality aren't mutually exclusive. Bumpy could simultaneously serve his self-interest and acknowledge the humanity of a man who'd wronged him. He could recognize that Slim's betrayal came from desperation to save his daughter and decide that a father's love, even expressed through betrayal, deserved a different response than a greedy man's betrayal would merit. This nuance is important because it resists the temptation to either glorify Bumpy as a folk hero or dismiss him as merely a criminal. He was both and neither. He was a man navigating impossible choices in a system designed to destroy black humanity, using tools that ranged from violence to mercy, operating according to a code that was simultaneously ruthless and strangely principled. The Slim Peterson decision revealed that code in its full complexity. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement intensified and black power philosophy emerged, Bumpy's relationship with his community became even more nuanced. Leaders like Malcolm X saw in Bumpy both a cautionary tale about the limited options available to black men in America and an example of strategic thinking that could be redirected toward liberation rather than crime. Malcolm and Bumpy had extensive conversations about power, strategy, and the psychology of oppression. Malcolm once asked Bumpy whether he regretted his life choices. Bumpy's response was characteristically complex. Regret is for people who had choices. I made the choices I had, but I'll tell you what I don't regret. Every time I showed that you could be smart instead of just violent, every time I protected this community from people who wanted to destroy it, every time I demonstrated that black men could strategize and plan and win, I don't regret those moments. The Slim Peterson story was one of those moments. It demonstrated that even in the criminal underworld, intelligence could triumph over brutality, strategy could outperform instinct, and long-term thinking could yield better results than short-term satisfaction. These weren't lessons that applied only to crime. They were lessons about power itself, lessons that translated across contexts, lessons that continued to resonate decades after the specific circumstances faded from memory. When Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, he'd been out of prison for 5 years, following a long sentence in Alcatraz. He collapsed from a heart attack at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, still in Harlem, still close to the streets he'd dominated for 40 years. His funeral drew thousands of people, criminals and civilians, enemies and friends, people who feared him and people who loved him. The eulogy was delivered by Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who knew better than to sanitize Bumpy's history, but also refused to reduce him to his crimes. Bumpy Johnson was a complex man, Powell said. He broke laws, and he protected people. He hurt, and he healed. He was a product of a system that gave black men few options, and he made choices within those constraints that we can analyze and debate, but should not simplify. He showed us that intelligence matters, that strategy matters, that thinking 3 moves ahead matters. Those lessons transcend the context in which he learned them. Marcus Peterson sent a wreath to the funeral. The card read, "To the man who gave me life twice, once when he spared it, and again when he showed me how to use it. The story continues, and the story does continue. In Harlem barbershops and history books, in academic studies of organized crime and folklore passed between generations, Bumpy Johnson's legend persists. The Slim Peterson story is one thread in a larger tapestry, but it's a thread that reveals essential patterns. It shows that Bumpy understood power as psychological as much as physical. It demonstrates that unpredictability can be weaponized. It proves that mercy, strategically deployed, can be as effective as violence. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that human beings, even those we might be tempted to dismiss as simply criminal or simply evil, are capable of surprising complexity. They can make choices that confound expectations, that reveal hidden dimensions of their character, that resist simple moral categorization. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who occasionally chose mercy over murder. That paradox doesn't resolve cleanly. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to make us think more carefully about power, about justice, about the choices we all make when navigating systems that constrain our options. The night of November 7th, 1943, Bumpy Johnson sat across from a man who deserved to die by every rule of the world they inhabited and chose to let him live. That choice rippled forward through time, creating stories and strategies, influencing decisions and philosophies, demonstrating principles that transcended their criminal context. Slim Peterson lived 43 more years, raised a daughter who educated thousands of children, and told the story of his mercy to everyone who would listen. Was it justice? Was it strategy? Was it both? These are the questions we must ask. Bumpy Johnson operated in a world where traditional justice was unavailable to black people, where the legal system was designed to oppress rather than protect, where survival required tools that ranged from violence to mercy. He chose mercy when no one expected it, and that choice became part of his legend, part of his power, part of his legacy. We study Bumpy Johnson not to glorify crime, but to understand power. We analyze his decisions not to excuse his actions, but to learn from his strategic thinking. We remember Marcus Peterson not because his betrayal was forgivable, but because Bumpy's response revealed something profound about human complexity, about the space between strict enforcement of rules and complete abandonment of them, about the possibility that even in brutal systems, there's room for unexpected grace. That warehouse on 145th Street is long gone now, demolished in urban renewal projects that reshaped Harlem in the 1970s. But the story of what happened there persists, a story about a gangster who chose strategy over tradition, intelligence over instinct, long-term reputation over short-term satisfaction. A story about a betrayed man who found more value in mercy than murder. A story about power that can't be reduced to simple formulas or predictable responses. Bumpy Johnson understood something that many people spend their entire lives never learning, that the most powerful move is often the one no one sees coming, that breaking the rules strategically is different from abandoning them carelessly, that humanity, even in inhumane circumstances, can be both a weakness to exploit and a strength to deploy. The survivor's account, Marcus Peterson's story, became one of the most powerful weapons in Bumpy Johnson's arsenal. Not a gun, not a threat, but a story about the night he should have died and didn't. Told and retold until it became legend, creating uncertainty in enemies' minds, respect in allies' hearts, and complexity in the historical record that resists simple interpretation. That's the legacy of November 7th, 1943. Not a body in an alley, not a message written in blood, but a living man, a thriving daughter, a story that multiplied through countless retellings, and a lesson about power that continues to resonate decades after the specific circumstances faded into history. Bumpy Johnson let Marcus Peterson live, and in doing so, created something more valuable than fear. He created mystery. He created legend. He created a strategic weapon that no one could defend against because no one fully understood it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he also created a moment of genuine mercy in a world that desperately needed it. Whether that mercy was strategic or sincere, calculated or compassionate, is a question we'll never fully answer. But the fact that we're still asking it, still trying to understand the mind of the man who made that choice, is evidence of its enduring power. Bumpy Johnson died. Marcus Peterson died. But the story of the night they faced each other in that warehouse, the night Bumpy broke every rule and let a traitor live, that story lives on. It lives in academic papers and street legends, in strategic thinking and moral philosophy, in questions about power and justice that have no easy answers. That's why we remember. That's why we analyze. That's why the survivor's account matters. Because it reveals that even in Harlem's brutal underworld, even in a system designed to reduce human beings to binary choices of submit or resist, there was room for complexity, for strategic thinking that transcended simple categories, for choices that confounded expectations and created new possibilities. Bumpy Johnson showed us that the code isn't always what it seems, that rules can be broken intelligently, that power has dimensions beyond violence, and that sometimes the most devastating message isn't delivered through brutality, but through unexpected mercy. These lessons transcend their criminal context. They apply to anyone navigating systems of power, anyone facing impossible choices, anyone trying to operate strategically in a world that demands predictability. The man Bumpy Johnson let live became the messenger of a philosophy that challenged everything the criminal underworld thought it understood. And in doing so, Bumpy demonstrated the ultimate strategic principle, that the most powerful weapon isn't the one you use, but the one you visibly choose not to use when everyone expects you to. That restraint, that unpredictability, that complexity, that's the legacy of November 7th, 1943. That's the survivor's account. That's the story inside the mind of the man Bumpy Johnson let live. And that's why, 83 years later, we're still trying to understand it.